So the next topic of discussion is cluster IP. Actually, it is exactly same as that of node port. The only difference is that if you use services of type cluster IP, the service can be accessed only within the cluster. You cannot access it outside of the cluster. So this is our existing setup. We have two nodes with some IP address 10.168.1.2, 10.168.1.4 with deployment 1 with 8 number of pods. Then we created service and the service port is 8080. We do not have any node port. Now let's say we have another deployment which is hosting another application, and if this application wants to connect or communicate with the application in deployment 1, it will communicate using the cluster IP service. Now how to access within the cluster? So you get something called a cluster IP, and from using the cluster IP you access this particular service. Now the manifest file is very similar. Only difference is that in type we have cluster IP, if you see here, and in ports we do not have any node port. So we have target port and port, that's it. So port is the service port and the target port is where the application is being exposed to. So port actually belongs to the service, and then target port is the target port where the service wants to send traffic to eventually. That's all. Let's go over to the demo. It will be very similar. The only difference would be that we'll be creating a cluster IP and we'll be accessing the web page not from internet, only internally. So this is how it will be. There won't be any internet access. The service type would be cluster IP and everything would remain same. I'll not change the deployment, I'll not change the port. So I'll use the same deployment to create another service. If you are thinking, can we do that? The answer is of course yes, you can do that, but you should not. If you have an internal application, it's better to use a separate deployment and create a service to expose the application within the cluster. This is our current setup. kubectl get service in the namespace prod. We have this service which we had created earlier, and the name of the service is create a service and the type is node port. We used the external IP last time, and using the external IP and port number 32500, we were able to connect to the application from outside world. Can we do that within the cluster, given that we have a cluster IP? So the cluster IP here is 10, 106, 227 and 238. Now here's the thing, where this cluster IP came from. We did not mention any IP address. I'll discuss this in detail when we talk about kubeproxy and how service is implemented inside of Kubernetes. Anyway, let's not go there. So now I want to see, can I use this cluster IP to access the application internally? So if I use 32500, I should not get any output because 32500 is a node port, meaning this port is associated with the node IP, not the cluster IP. The cluster IP is internal. So if I use 8080, I should be able to access the application, and I am able to. So it means that using node port service type also we can access the application inside of the cluster. But of course the other way around is that it exposes the application to outside world also. Let us go ahead and create the cluster IP. First, let us see the manifest file. This is the manifest file for cluster IP. The name of the services, KTS service, cluster IP, everything is same, but the type is cluster IP instead of node port. We do not have node port here. We have target port, which is port 80, and a service port. I'll change it to 8081 because 8080 is being used by node port. So let us go ahead and create the service. And I'll have to create this in prod namespace, and there you go, it has been created. Let's see the other service. Now this is the new service, KTS service cluster IP. Type is of course cluster IP, and we have a cluster IP of 10, 101, 236 and 148. Now if you see the ports, It is different than a node port because in node port we have a mapping of service port and an actual port in the node or in the host. Now in this case, when we are using cluster IP, there's no mapping of any node port because of obvious reasons. That means that we cannot use this service to access the application from outside world. Outside world cannot access service port, it has to have a node port. So as there is no mapping, there cannot be any accessibility as well. Let us try to access this application within the cluster. So port would be 8081 and I should get some output, and there you go, it is working perfectly fine. So this is how you implement cluster IP also, and you might have noticed the difference in the ports. There's no mapping of node port in this case. Now the internal IP address of this service also is 10, 101, 236 and 148, where the services are getting these IP addresses from. Now let us go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into services.